What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Ascent Athlete Podcast. Today for episode 8, we have Troy Tolar back on. He's the mental skills coach for the Owls. We're super excited to get him back on. Very knowledgeable about this topic. This is going to be an awesome episode. I'm super excited for you guys to get into it. Let's jump right in. What's up, guys? Let's jump right into this episode. Troy, how you doing, man? How you been?
I'm doing great. How about you, Josh?
I'm doing very, very good. Last time we talked a lot about getting back to neutral, what that actually means, how you do it, the concepts behind that. And since then, you and I have kind of dug deeper on some different mental concepts. Let's get right into it. Let me hear your thoughts.
I love the inner game of tennis. I know we're going to talk a lot about that, but it's such a cool book that it just relates so much to getting to neutral, and it takes what it takes with neutral thinking. And I can't wait to dive more into the self 1 and self 2 stuff.
Let's do it, man. Let's do it. So in the inner game of tennis, it talks a lot about self 1 versus self 2. The thing that I think is super interesting about that is self 1 is essentially the voice in your head, right? Like, do this mechanically, try to accomplish this, whatever it may do. And then self 2 is just your unconscious mind, what you actually know how to do, letting your body kind of take over, trusting yourself to essentially do it. I think it's super fascinating, especially when we talk about training athletes and kind of getting into the weeds of how that athlete understands what we're saying and translates that to their specific movement pattern. It's super, super interesting to kind of learn the psychology of what's actually going on in the brain.
Yeah, it's really crazy to like hearing it. It's like things but you didn't really ever like connect together. And I love like the self 2. Like sometimes we just need to get out of our own way. We need to help get our brains out of our own way because our bodies know what to do once they can visualize it and see the right thing to do. And sometimes too many cues helps us. It makes our self 1 kick into overdrive, and then we're so focused on doing that we tense up, and then we can't actually do what we're trying to get our body to do.
For sure. I always think it's funny just with the overall premise of the book of self 1, self 2, talking about how to kind of coach that. There's a lot of different anecdotes in there that are kind of interesting, but the one that kind of applies in real time to working with an athlete is always like, do you trust yourself to do it? And having that belief and understanding, like, ultimately that's what it comes down to. If you're able to like do the movement once, like your body knows how to do it. Trust yourself to do it. Trust yourself to execute it. Don't overcomplicate the thought process to do it. Just go execute. You know you can.
Right. And I love how they use the idea in the book of kind of almost distracting our self 1 with other things to allow our body just to do what it already knows how to do. And that's like kind of where that trust yourself is. So they talk a lot about, focusing on the seams, just the seams of the ball while you're playing tennis, or even I think this is such a great reminder. Like if you're hitting, like just focus on the seams. You're not focused on anything else but the seams, and then it just gets your self 1 out of the way of trying to do too much, and it just allows your body to do what it knows how to do and just hit the ball, put good wood on the ball and stuff. So I think it's pretty awesome. It's pretty crazy stuff.
Absolutely. And even going into a little bit deeper of how do you trust yourself? I think the idea of visualization is super important. And you and I talked ad nauseum about visualization and prepping myself and prepping my teammates and how that plays directly into what we're doing. Visualization is super important. It kind of goes into like a mental priming aspect of things that we'll touch later on in this episode. But visualization, watching yourself execute the movement correctly, knowing you can receive a good result from that movement pattern is so incredibly powerful. The subconscious mind is going to take over if we allow it to. If we get self 1 out of the way, if we allow all those thoughts to just kind of get out of the way of what we're actually trying to execute, like the body's going to take over and we're going to do what we need to do.
Yeah, visualization is huge, and it's pretty amazing what you can do with visualization. Like I wish a lot of our athletes would focus more on visualization because there's been studies done that when you do visualization, and they have you hooked up to like your brain and your body hooked up to sensors and everything, is they can see the muscles twitching for what you're visualizing. So your body's still even starting to do those movements, even though you're not actually doing them, just by visualizing them. And it's so powerful. It's so effective for helping yourself train when you're not able to actually do the movements. And this way, it's a good way to visualize without wearing down your body. And sometimes it can be more powerful than actual reps, from overdoing it with physical reps.
And I think that's a super interesting concept to kind of get into as well, with how much work is too much work. At what point is our central nervous system just absolutely taxed? At what point are we not recovering properly because we're putting in too much? It's a super interesting balance, right? The story I'll talk about right now is I had a kid in here at Ascent. We've been working this catching, throwing progression for months. Like, I want to say it was like a 5-month journey. He took 2 weeks off just because his hip was bugging him. He went to PT, like kind of got it all figured out. Came back and beat his best pop time by like a tenth of a second. And all he said he really did was just took time off. And like when he came back, he was just like, I'm just going to trust my body to go do the movement pattern it knows how to do. So with the accompaniment of being fresh, his mind being fresh, him kind of being excited to get back out there, just accumulated into like the perfect storm of a semi flow state for him, which I think is a great transition to talk about flow state.
Yeah. Before we move on to that, I just like one more thing. Like anybody who's ever golfs, I know you golf, I golf, and like sometimes if you haven't played golf in a little while, you're like you go out there with zero expectations. You're like, I'm just gonna go play. I have no expectations and just play. And you're playing so free. You play well for like the first 6 holes, and then you're like, oh, I'm feeling it today. And then you're like, okay, now I'm gonna start trying to do more and more. And then all of a sudden you start doing terribly. Is because that self one gets in the way because you try to make it better, but that like free state of like I'm going out here and I'm just going to play and have fun and without expectations because you haven't played in a while. Like sometimes that's some of the best golf you'll play, and it translates to every sport. Like it happens all the time.
I call that mental jail on the golf course. Where,
Yeah. Oh man, mental jail is a great way of putting that.
because I mean, like the first few holes, I mean, like I can't tell you how many times I take no warm up swings. I just go to the first tee with the anticipation of taking a breakfast ball, and then you just stripe your first drive, and then you immediately go, "What did I just do there? How do I replicate that?" Right? Like self one just takes over. It absolutely takes over. And especially even relating that to baseball training, I think it's pretty uniform across the board where I find this fairly consistently. Where if we're doing some sort of challenge day, so we're hitting like really high velo with like lighter balls, and the movements are bigger and larger than what is normally like expected of that ball. Um, the athlete will struggle, struggle, struggle. They'll just crush one, and then almost every time they step out and go, and like they look at their bat, they start thinking about what they're doing, and then the next 5 swings suck.
Yep. And they talk about that in the inner game of tennis too, about how like you'll do something right a couple times, but as soon as you start like trying to repeat that, then self one takes over and you're trying to coach yourself into that, and then it's gone. You lost it. It's over.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I think for me, um, kind of quantifying that as flow state is really interesting. Where um, the flow state, you're not thinking about what you're doing. Like your thoughts are super simple. You're just in a place of kind of go do it. Like you can. Like your confidence is so high. Getting to that point is what athletes covet. That's almost what we're chasing after. 99% of the time is getting to that flow state, and it's such an interesting dance that athletes do to kind of get there.
Yeah, and I think flow state. I think that's why we talk a lot about we've talked a lot about cues and kind of reminders like that you do every time for what you feel like you're doing when you're being successful. Is those aren't to tell yourself to do them as much as you're distracting yourself so much. You're saying them to yourself so your mind can hear those, but you're not forcing yourself to try to do those. If and you and I have talked so much about cues and how effective they can be in just helping you clear your mind, be in the present. You're not trying to do too much. You're not trying to do too little. You're just being engaged in that moment, and that's it. And that's a big part of neutral.
I think it's huge, right? And I think it's super interesting how delicate the flow state is. Um, like it's incredible. I was having a conversation with an athlete last night. It's his first year in college. He won like hustler of the week or whatever. He's like, I hit 2 home runs in a week in scrimmages. Like I'm going off. And then he got recognized as like hustler of the week. And he's like, dude, I felt on top of the world. Like I'm walking around, my chest is out. And then as soon as it came game time again, I stepped in the box and I was just like, oh gosh, everyone's looking at me, you know? So like it's so interesting to see like kind of what the flow state is. And truthfully, like that almost kind of brought up a different topic for me in terms of why are we doing what we do? You know, whatever it may be in this life. Um, and the conversation kind of progressed to, look, man, like we all know that we work hard, right? Like there's a good chance, specifically with this athlete, he works his butt off. And I'm just like, are you working your butt off so that other people notice, or are you working your butt off to figure out who you are as a baseball player and who you are as a person? They're two different things. Um, if you're working your butt off to find out who you are as a person, you don't care if people notice. If you're working your butt off for the acknowledgement of others and for people to go, man, he works hard, that's all you're going to care about. And that might mess with your flow state in the end.
Well, and I think it just comes back to like, we talked about earlier this year, we talked about something I was going to do with my players, and you're talking about, you're trying to reach this goal. Like we've talked about, like, hey, you're trying to win the championship, right? And then we talked about ripping that goal up, because that's literally everybody's goal. There's nobody that doesn't have the goal of winning when you're talking about your goals, but instead focusing on how you're going to reach those goals, right? And then how impactful that can be on why you do what you do every day. You're not focused on, I'm doing this for the accolades from others. I'm doing this thing right in front of me. This is how I'm going to get to where I'm trying to get. And it helps you lock in on why you're doing things and doing them for the right reasons, and not for that outside, accolades, because we all know that never lasts. And, you can be great one day and then awful the next. And then all of a sudden you feel like nobody notices. So,
Yep. Or they notice in a bad way, and that's almost even worse. Yes.
yes. And that's right. Well, and I think we do that to ourselves though, right? Like we've talked about that, where our pride comes in, and we feel like as soon as we have a bad day, we feel like the whole world is watching us and everybody's, saying we suck and everything. But usually that's just our inner voice, and it's not really what our teammates think. And I always go back to what we've talked about as a lot, is like, you know, how do you see your teammates when they fail? Do you think they suck, or are you just like, oh man, he had a bad day, but I still know he's a great player? But that's not often how we talk to ourselves. And so you and I have talked about, like, only talk to yourself the same way you would talk to your teammate. Never talk to yourself worse than you would talk to a teammate.
Absolutely. Um, One of my favorite quotes of all time. It's like a really old Driveline video. Um, but in the video, the premise is essentially a pitcher trying to get healthy and get back to where he was. And he just drops this like ultimate quote bomb that like I think is so impactful. But hard work doesn't guarantee results; it guarantees honesty. And ultimately, going into anything that you do, uh, kind of making sure that we're hitting the checkpoints of what we want to get better at, quantifying what those specific KPIs are is huge, right? Like that's a part of having a more advanced plan and like what's going to separate you. But on the flip side, the hard work doesn't guarantee you're going to achieve that. It's going to guarantee you're going to find out who you are. And you have to be okay with that. Like that's part of the journey, you know?
Yep. And we've talked about that, and I think that relates so much to our habits, which you and I have talked way more at length than anybody probably ever wants to hear about habits, because we love habits, right? But we don't, and we see it all the time. Like athletes, especially, like for the Owls, we're playing 96 games every summer, and you find out who puts in the work for the habits, and that hard work often comes up in habits when you're playing 96 games. The guys who are tired but still stick to their habits of working out, keeping their bodies in shape, doing their routine every day to make sure they're mentally and physically ready every day. They're the guys that often have success, but they're the guys that are able to stay neutral throughout the whole season. And when you find guys who aren't doing those things, their bodies break down, their physicality breaks down, their mental state breaks down, and it all relates back to that hard work. Is going to show you who you are when you're tired, when you don't want to work, when you just don't want to do it, but you do it anyway because you've established those habits. And you and I have talked about, like, those habits have to be established before that season starts. If you don't start them before the season starts, they're never going to last through the season. You can't just start them day one of the season and think this is going to be easy, because you and I both know habits are so not easy.
They're the hardest thing to do. They really are, man. Um, and I think one of my favorite quotes as well from the inner game of tennis is, the ability to focus the mind is the ability to not let it run away with you. It does not mean not to think, but to be the one who directs your own thinking. To me, that's just like directly in correlation to what flow state is, directly in correlation to why we're doing the work we're doing. What kind of reward do we expect on the other end of work, right? Where finding out who you are, like, ultimately that's kind of the mission, right? And being able to control your thoughts for, okay, trust myself, I know how to do it, I know people are watching me now, doesn't matter. Like, they don't matter in this process. I'm doing this for myself and for my teammates and for my family, whoever it may be, right? Like, having that bigger purpose is huge. Um, but yeah, I love that quote.
Yeah, I think it's such a good quote, and it really is just the ability to, you know, not let yourself run away, not let that self one completely take over and just run away with everything. And I think, especially when we fail, it's easy to let our mind run away with things. But that's why we talk so much about neutral thinking and getting back to neutral. So that way we cannot let our mind just run away, and we're directing what we're focusing on. And it all relates, we can get ourselves back to the present moment, the next pitch, the next swing, whatever it is, because we're able to get back to that moment and just focus on that one thing. And that's where the cues come in, is that helps us get there. That's our ability to kind of flush everything else out to get back to that neutral moment and the present. And I think it directly relates to that quote. I think it's all intertwined.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, man. Like, the more I read about the inner game of tennis and just trying to achieve flow state and trusting yourself, it's incredible. Um, there's a really cool part in the book where it talks about like a player's backhand or forehand. I forget which one it is. But like, seeing visually what that player was doing helped them a lot.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he talks about how this guy asked him, like, hey, I've been seeing six pros and I can't fix my backhand. They say I'm not getting my elbow up high enough. And he, like, dry swings him a couple times. And sure enough, he's never getting his elbow high enough. And then all he does, the only instruction he gives him is he just brings him over to a window, and he has him do it again where the player can see that he's not getting. He's like, oh, I'm really not. Like, he never actually believed that he wasn't able to do it until he saw it for himself. And then once he saw it, he was able to fix it. And he's like, oh, this guy's a genius. But all he really did was just help him see it in himself. And it was just too much of self one taking over. And his body knew what to do the whole time once it was able to visualize it and see it physically.
Yeah, it's actually incredible when you get into like different athletes' specific proprioception, or just like their awareness of their body moving through space. And that's why I think incorporating all the tools into some sort of training plan and coaching experience is super important, right? Where um, specifically to us, like, we use a lot of different metrics, whether it's a blast sensor, whether it's hit tracks, whether it's video, right? Like, not a singular one of those is the end all be all. They all kind of connect to each other. And at the end of the day, when you get into the principles of motor learning, the most important one is like, what's the actual physical result of what's happening, right? So it's this hierarchy of what's the athlete thinking, what's the athlete kinematically doing, and then what's the athlete actually, like, what's the result of that movement. Um, and using all those pieces to kind of put together this massive puzzle of player development is so interesting. Where some guys lean heavier on video, some guys lean heavier on just like total feel, right? Where there's not one cookie cut way to develop a guy. It's going to be a lot of flowing from kind of baseline to baseline and kind of getting that athlete to figure out their own specific movement patterns, and then specifically trusting themselves to do it, showing them, having them execute it, and then trusting themselves to go do it again and again.
Yep, and I love how they touch on that in the inner game of tennis too. Like, what certain physical movements might work for one player, and it's going to be different for another player because no, we're not all the same in the way our body moves, where our strengths are, and so that's a big piece of that too. That you have to then also see, okay, this player by his body profile, how is he gonna? What's going to be most effective for him in his swing and his throw and everything, and so that plays a big part of it to make it individual, and that's why it's like there's no cookie cutter approach to any player physically, mentally, anything.
Yeah, it's crazy. Um, and I think like that kind of relates to mental priming, right? Or we kind of touched on that a little bit earlier in the episode. And mental priming is like this crazy phenomenon when exposure to one stimulus influences a person's response to other stimuluses, right? So, um, kind of like a body language or a visual or whatever it may be can affect what's actually happening in the mind. Um, a really interesting study that was done was actually about headphones. And they kind of went into it with the thought of, hey, we're having you test the headphones, right? We'll play a message to the headphones, but we're having you test the quality of the headphones. One group was kind of instructed to nod their head like this, yes. And then another group was instructed to nod their head like this, no. Just to kind of see how the headphones would hold, if the sound quality changed, whatever it may be, right? Like it was all an elaborate plan on a study of mental priming where the participants that were testing, quote unquote, testing the headphones by shaking their head yes, agreed with the message being played through the headphones way more on average than the group shaking their head no. Whether they realized it or not, super, super interesting study, right? Where just like your body language, like your physical movements, like your kinematic, like, yes, I'm shaking my head, yes, of I'm testing the headphones. Like you're not even thinking about the message. And then they ask you at the end, like, oh, what'd you think of the message? And they're like, I agreed with it. And the group shaking their head no is like, nah, not so much.
Yeah, I know I remember that too. And then from that same book, they also talk about, well, like, you have a pencil and you put it in your mouth sideways and you bite down on it, which makes you smile, or you put the pencil in your mouth straight on and you have to bite it down, which makes you frown. And the same thing, your body reacts differently based on just whether you were in the group with it sideways to make you smile or frown, and how that affects our bodies is wild stuff.
It's crazy. Just the subconscious mind and the mental priming of everything and like getting into like the heuristics of the mind. So just essentially like those little shortcuts that our mind kind of has in place to like make decisions for us and help us think. Um, they can be good, but they can also trick us a lot. And if you actually train yourself the right way, you can trick yourself into feeling good, which is super, super interesting.
Yes, and I think the great part about that is we know that our bodies or our minds are always going to go to the easiest path of least path of least resistance. We're always Our minds want to always take the easiest path thinking and everything, and that's why it's so important. I think the way we talk to ourselves, the thoughts we put in our head. We mentioned last time about not saying stupid stuff out loud, but even like tiny little negative thoughts or how we view things, they'll have an impact on your training, on your habits, how you approach your training. And just like you're talking about, you can trick yourself into feeling good even when you may not be, like performing at the level you want to perform at, by having the right approach to your training and really minimizing your mind's ability to think negatively, to see things negatively. And we talk a lot about like every swing, every pitch, every throw, everything you do is a learning opportunity, and not seeing that as a failure, but something you're learning from. And like one of the big things that you and I talked about early on when we started working together was not seeing things as you're trying something new, especially when you're doing a new drill that like you're like, this is going to be challenging. You're not trying to do it, you're training in it to be able, and training or teaching our minds to say we're training in something instead of trying something. It tricks our brain into thinking, oh, I may not be good at this at first, but I'm going to get better at it as I keep doing it because I'm training in it. I'm not just trying to do it. Because when we say we're trying, it basically gives ourselves our a way out, and it tells us it's okay to fail and not be successful, and then we just quit and get up because we were just trying it. but instead we're training at it with a focused approach to get better at it.
Yes, and like to me that directly correlates to like what confirmation bias actually is. And specifically when training and kind of getting into the more intricacies of like what's happening within the athlete's mind, the athlete already has some sort of concept of like what quote unquote works for them, right? From an objective point of view, like we see that as coaches in different ways, but being able to communicate with that specific athlete in a way that makes sense to them is super important, right? And confirmation bias can be really good for an athlete, but it also can be like extremely dangerous where, hey, this movement pattern or like this specific approach has worked for me for so long. And we kind of get that like mental heuristic of like, that's all I'm going to do ever because it worked for me for this amount of time, whatever it may be, right? And like kind of fighting that urge of change, fighting that urge of adaptation and adjustment can actually be super detrimental to an athlete where specifically talking about the mindset and like trying new things. Well, yeah, like you're going to try it, but like training in those things with backed up data, backed up science of like, this is good for you. Like, we know this is good for you. We need to kind of meet the hitter or meet the player where they're at and explain why it's good for them and try to like, not necessarily convince them why, but like almost educate them and help them understand like, hey man, you're a really good baseball player. This is what could make you even better and kind of get them out of that confirmation bias of their own.
Yeah, I see that a lot, especially when athletes are moving from one level to the next level. So, for example, seeing an athlete moving from like little league or middle school levels to like on a competitive team to a travel team to into high school, you see that a lot because a lot of times they've been doing something that works at that level, even if it may not be the best, like the right way to do it, but it works. So they think that's what they have to always do, and then they find out very quickly. Coaches will try to say, hey, like this isn't probably going to work at this level, or we need to adjust this to make you be more successful at this level. And they kind of fight that because they're like, but this has worked for so long. But as they go to that next team, not really having that open mind to be able to learn and grow as an athlete. And I think you see so many athletes kind of hit their ceiling when they don't have to because they're unwilling to make those changes and adjustments when they need to physically, mentally, and stuff. Because everybody is coming from probably one of the best players on their team to the next level where they're just part of that team now, and everybody has to learn to adapt and fill that role. You can't have a team of 15 all-stars, and you see that from high school to college too. Like everybody's probably their best player on their high school team, and now they're in college, and now they're somewhere in the mix. You can't. It changes the way you have to approach things.
Absolutely. And I think one of my favorite quotes about just even evaluating players in general is when we look at a player's numbers or we look at some of the more intricate sabermetrics of baseball, and something sticks out, and the athlete may be combative to the idea of trying to improve that certain metric or combative to the idea of, hey, like we need to work on this specifically. Um, my favorite quote that I've ever been told is like, the game doesn't get easier as you move up, it gets harder, right? So like that issue now is just going to be magnified at the next level you play at. And then if you continue to move up, it gets magnified again. And eventually you're not good enough to play anymore because you have this deficiency wherever it may be, whether it's a big deal or not, is relative to the player. But the game's not getting easier. In fact, the game's getting drastically harder with talent level. I mean, for crying out loud, I played baseball at a semi-high level, like independent professional baseball, and it's like, man, we saw 95 pretty regularly, and it's like, why are you here? You know what I mean? It's because the game has grown so much. The game's gotten so much better in terms of what's happening, and like good is relative to what is actually happening right now. And always kind of understanding like if you want to move up, you need to improve certain things in your game. Like it's just not going to magically get better as you move on.
Right. Yeah, and it's not going to just fix itself, and that's why it takes work to be able to improve your game physically and mentally if you want to be able to move on. And like you and I have talked about this a lot. Like if you're playing independent pro baseball, you probably have the talent to play in double A, triple A, possibly even the major leagues. That's not the difference. The difference is not physically. It's all mentally. And that's what separates, the guys in the major leagues from lower levels is their ability to mentally stay where they need to be every single day for a long time, and weather those seasons of when you may not be hitting well or pitching well, and working through that a lot. It all comes down to that mental part of the game.
And I think it's super interesting when you look at a mental, like, kind of makeup of a player. Um, it's crazy to watch like the differences and like how certain guys handle certain things. Where like this is an awesome story, but we have a first rounder that trains with us, Kevin McGonigal, and he is every definition of the term an absolute freak. Like just super athletically gifted, uh, really knows his swing, hits the ball really well. Like metrics beyond this year were like all on par with major league average, right? But the game gets harder as you keep going. Got to keep that in mind. Um, but day one with us, he's in the cage and he's like, I'm just going to keep it light and easy, right? Like I throw him some flips, we get him kind of going a little bit. Then BP comes around and he's like, hold on. And he goes and looks at our pro leaderboards and he's like, who's got the best exit velocity right now? And this is day one for Kevin, right? Like, and he just turned it into his entire mission to beat that. And he did, right? Like, I think he ended up hitting a ball like 108 or 109, like something absurd for day one. And we're picking up balls after, and he just kind of goes like, I need to get better at that. And I'm like, do you? Like, maybe, like, yeah, probably learning how to control that and like putting some sort of governor on it so that you know when to kind of hit the gas and like also like, hey man, it's day one, it doesn't really matter. We're just getting back in the swing of things. Like, yeah, that could be beneficial, but like never lose that competitive edge in you. Like you walked in, you like pretended to go look at the leaderboard during VP. Like I know you saw that when you walked in. Like I saw you. Like you looked at it and went, all right, don't ever change that, right? Like that competitive edge, that almost like Mamba mentality of things of like, I'm going to beat you today. Don't ever change that. As he gets older, as he matures, he'll have a better governor on that. But I was like, you don't need to change that right now. We just need to get better at controlling it.
Yeah. And I mean, that's how you train to be successful, is having that ability to have that competitiveness when you train, because it trains you at full speed. And, like you and I have talked a lot about when we do train, having a purpose in our training for what kind of, different situations, putting that mental pressure on yourself. Like, hey, it's the eighth inning and I really need to come up with a hit here. How do I train for that? You train for it by, that's your approach every swing during your training sessions. That way, mentally, when you go into that game and that situation happens, that moment's not too big for you because you've already trained for that moment hundreds and hundreds of times.
Yeah. And that's the other thing too, even with specifically of putting yourself in specific situations in training so that you're ready for it in the game. There's also a huge value in training that and then failing in it as well. Like handling failures 70% of baseball if you're really good, 70% of hitting if you're really good, right? Like you're going to get out a lot, and being put in those situations and failing in training and how we handle that situation when the pressure's a little bit lower. You're creating the pressure in your mind, like you're putting yourself in that situation. Being able to handle that failure in that situation is unbelievably powerful. Like it's crazy to see how it correlates with, guys that get super frustrated in training, like they get super frustrated in the games. Guys that don't get super frustrated in training, like they usually keep their cool a little bit better. Um, it's just super interesting to me to where, yes, like we're training to have success in that moment, but like we're also training on how to handle the failure if we don't succeed in that moment, which 70% of the time we're not going to.
Yeah. And if I could say, like, the biggest piece of advice I could give to, coaches, athletes, anyone listening to this is, don't let yourselves handle failure negatively in training, in practice, because all you're doing is training yourself to do that in games. And, coaches, don't let your athletes handle failure negatively in practice, because if you do, you're going to see that in the game and you'd be like, why are they doing this? It's because you allowed that to happen. So don't allow that to happen in their training, in practice, because that's going to transition into games. And if you can create a culture on your team where there is no negative response when you fail in practice, you're going to that's going to happen in games, and the chemistry of the team is going to be so much better because they're all going to know how to handle that failure, and it's going to set them up for success on that team and in life.
How have you witnessed like mental performance training as a team impact team chemistry?
I think the biggest thing is, you see as teammates see other guys have success with mental training and see how they respond differently, how they perform better, that spreads. Guys get hungry for it, and they're like, oh, that's a competitive edge that I want as well. And you know, I think it's huge. It's such an advantage if you're mentally training in some way, right? You and I have talked about, like, if you're getting 1% better mentally every day, then how much better are you going to be at the end of the season? That's an advantage you have over everyone else that you're playing against, your opponents, because you're getting better than them every single day. It's going to be exponential. And I think that spreads throughout a team, and it changes the way the teammates look at each other. It changes the way they respond to each other. And it really does change how they fail, how they succeed, and it's contagious. And when guys start going and they see success, then everybody feeds off that. But also, when players fail, but they're mentally strong, they don't react in a super negative way, it doesn't have that negative effect on the team. And which we've talked about a lot is negativity breeds negativity 100% of the time. So if you have a player that's responding negatively to failure in the games or practice, everybody thinks that's okay now, and that's the standard. So then everybody does it, and then you have this toxic culture of negativity during failure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the other interesting thing too is like there's so many different levels to failure. And like one of the things that like we kind of talked about was failing within the own mental approach, right? That it's going to happen. And it's again how you bounce back from that. You're going to miss days. Don't miss two though. Like that's when it starts to become a habit. You're going to strike out and you're going to get mad. Uh, that's okay. Don't let it happen twice in a row. Like bringing yourself back to neutral, getting yourself back to some sort of a mindset of, okay, why am I doing this? Let's check back in. How can I keep moving forward? And like just assessing the different levels of failure, I think is super interesting with, like you're not only going to fail in baseball, like physically in the game, but like you're also going to have mental failures at times. And being able to bounce back from those mental failures, like that can compound too. We're like, like I threw my bat, like, gosh, like whatever, like you strike out again and like you just do it again. You're like, whoa, like, holy cow, like reset, get back to where I need to be. If you're failing in the game, like you have control over yourself. Like don't let yourself fail.
Yeah, and I think, going back to like how we fail and knowing you're going to mess up at times, and holding yourself accountable. Like, I think one of the most impactful things you can do is if you do something and you knew you reacted not a way you want to react, is owning that with your team and being able to, and then ask your team to hold you accountable. Like, there's no better leader you could be if you don't, if and besides doing that, if you do that well, then your team is going to see you as a leader because you're willing to admit when you make a mistake, when you screw up, and it creates that culture of holding each other accountable to that higher level.
Yes, absolutely. And accountability, I think, it's talked about a lot, but I don't think the depth of it is talked about it enough. Where it's such a powerful thing to mess up and then to own your mess up. It's so incredibly powerful to do something wrong and like whoever you did wrong go up to them and be like, yo man, I messed up. Like I'm sorry. Like that's incredible because not only one are you taking the blame, you're taking accountability for it, but then you're passing the ball to them saying, do you accept me? I know I messed up. Like, can we move forward from this? And now it's on them, right? Or like it's a super interesting kind of dynamic of like where the blame's going. It's on you. Okay, I'm stopping the blame at myself. Do you accept my apology for the blame? You know, um, and all that's going to do is build relationships and build team chemistry even further, right? Where like if that guy messes up, he has the ability to look at himself and go, I messed up, right? Like he may not necessarily need to get called out, and if he does get called out, he might be like, you're right, I messed up, right? So I even think that in itself is incredibly powerful for team chemistry.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think, we're talking bigger than baseball, like not only in team chemistry, but in life. The ability to own your mess ups is only going to benefit you in every aspect of your life, in every relationship you have, whether it's on or off the field, because it's hard to do. It's hard to separate our pride. We all know it, especially, as baseball players and as athletes, we have the ability to be super prideful in what we do and how we do it, and we want to perform at a high level always. But being able to own when you mess up allows you the ability to grow from that, learn from that, and get better from it.
Yeah, I mean, I love talking about accountability. I think like even just talking with athletes, like, dude, I mess up every day. Every day I mess up, and owning the mess up, moving forward from it, having the people around me, my teammates right now, be like, oh, he knows he messed up. Like that's so powerful. It's incredible, right? Like the respect almost even gets better from that point of view. Um, and it's just a really cool thing to watch, right? And like it's super powerful just for you as a human being to be able to recognize like you're not always going to be right.
Right. Yeah. And I think, especially, like in our roles as coaches and leaders, like, especially, and, like anyone who's in a position of leadership, when you're able to own that mess up to who you're working with, like I would say, like, when like you and I have had conversations where, like, hey, and I've been like, hey, man, I could have done better in this. I should have done better in this with you. Is like our relationship's able to grow, our respect grows for each other when we've done that with each other, but it can grow as a coach to your team too when you're able to say, hey, I messed this up. I needed to do this better. I should have done this better. That's my bad. I'm going to learn from it. And then it creates that culture within your whole team.
Absolutely. No, it's this has been an unreal episode, man. I think just the overall concepts that we covered of trusting yourself, mental priming, um, being able to trust that change, and then having accountability for it is just like ultimately we got into a lot of pillars of what good mental training looks like and just overall mental stability as a human being as well. Um, I'm super excited for this episode to get out there. Troy, thank you so much for joining, man. As always, it's been unbelievably electric. Uh, I'm so happy for you. What you do for people and how you help them grow is unbelievable. And getting an opportunity to kind of help you reach more people has been an absolute blessing, man. I appreciate you.
Yep, thank you. It's an honor to be for you to ask me to do this every time I get to do it. I'll never say no. So I love this stuff. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Thanks, guys.